Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be here at the Library of Congress. I can't tell you how many libraries I used. I use them all the time when I'm writing. And a tremendous pleasure to be at this book festival. Thanks to all the staff for making this all happen. It's quite a production. I am here to tell you a little bit about what I learned about termites and how I became obsessed enough about termites, or with termites, to spend 10 years following them to write a book. I think what most people know about termites is that they, in relationship to libraries, is that they eat books. They eat lots of books. In fact, it's a big concern for libraries. But I'm going to just tell you a little bit about how I came to write this book and how I came to fall in love with termites. This is a kind of an unimpressive, dry, deserty place that I went to in 2008. It was the summer of 2008. I was invited by a bunch of scientists to come on what they called a termite safari. Now, why would a person drop all their work and go on a termite safari? Well, 2008, I was actually fairly at the end of my rope, basically. I had worked in the early 2000s. I had spent about 5 years writing a book about oil. And then I had become kind of an oil expert, sort of, or I had to write about oil all the time. I had to think about oil constantly. Oil was always on my mind, and oil was always kind of a problem, and one that was very difficult for us to solve. And so sometime in there, I ran into this group of scientists who were working at the Joint Genome Institute in Walnut Creek, California, to find genes in the guts of termites that were capable of dissolving wood. Now, termites are one of the few creatures on the earth, besides shipworms and some others, who can actually eat wood and digest it and turn it into fuel. So the idea behind this Department of Energy project was that we would go to the termites, find out what genes the termites used for dissolving wood, and kind of upload that into our own captive microorganisms and produce biofuels. So this was one way of solving the oil problem. So I went out on the termite safari in the hopes of seeing how you chase termites and how you find the genes to reinvent the economy. And what I actually found was the termites. So one of the things that happened, I guess, through this time, I realized that termites are a little guide to really big ideas. They tell us lots about the environment. They tell us lots about the possibilities of applying nature to technology. And they also give us all sorts of new ideas about how we look at ourselves and how we look at the world. And I think one of the things that really came home to me was that termites showed me how the world worked. They showed me a different way. You know, when you spend a lot of time thinking about oil, you feel like the world works mostly on people. It works on substances and the economy. It works on money. It works on also, of course, environmental destruction and climate change, these sorts of things. The termites were something that was kind of humming along beneath the surface. But the other thing that termites brought me to understand was how we know what we know. And I think that's a really interesting topic that in science books, we often look at science as finding out what the truth is. But there are truths that we all believe, but we don't know how we know them. And following termites kind of brought me into that world. And I have to say that when I landed in this weird, desolate country looking for termites, you know, you run around through the desert trying to find termites, I wasn't that impressed by what that landscape looked like. I just thought it was kind of weird and forbidding, and I wanted to find the termites. I came to see that land really differently through this 10-year process. So now I just want to tell you a little bit about termites. So termites, until 2007, we thought termites were their own kind of bug. Well, we didn't really think that since the 1920s, we've had some different ideas about termites. But it was only in 2007 that they officially stopped being their own bug and became a social cockroach, a highly evolved cockroach. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the story behind how the cockroaches became termites. So sometime about 150 million years ago, the cockroaches were solitary bugs, and they were running around underneath the dinosaurs and eating fruit. And when they had some eggs, they would sort of shoot them out their backsides at a high rate of speed, and then they'd run away from the eggs, and the eggs would just develop themselves. So what happened was there was a lot of wood around, and they started eating, we don't know exactly what the order of things was, but they ate some microbes who were capable of digesting that wood, which made the termites capable of digesting that wood. But the problem is that if you're a cockroach, you molt your intestines. So somehow they all started hanging out and not running away from each other, but hanging out together and eating what we politely call wood shake from each other's butts. They were eating the microbial solution from each other, so they started pooling their digestion. And this started changing who these cockroaches were, and they started changing and shifting into termites. So they pooled their digestion, and then they began to live kind of all together as a superorganism. That's a very unscientific term, but there were soldiers, and there were workers, and there's a queen, and there's a king, usually. And they divided the responsibilities for the success of the whole colony amongst themselves. So the queen began to do all of the reproduction, and the soldiers soldier termites are really fabulous. There's many different head designs that they have. Some are a wedge, and they just jam their wedgy head into holes in the mound, and nobody can come through. And some of them have mandibles that snap like this, and some have asymmetrical mandibles that snap like that, and they just launch themselves out at the outside world that's attacking and snap them with their mandibles. And some, like in this picture, have a little sort of a nozzle on their head, and they shoot chemicals called terpenes out their head to stop invaders. So there's all of these different fabulous termite soldier designs. And then the workers do the food, and they do the child care, and they kind of run around. One of the things that's interesting about termites is that they are a neoteny. The queen develops into an adult, and the king develops into adult, but all the other ones are kids. They're kids forever, stuck there all together. And sometimes they live for 20 years or so. We don't know exactly how long they live. But as they lived together, they also began to live together. They also gave up things, like they lost their eyes. And the workers and the soldiers lost their wings. Only the reproductive queens and kings have wings. This relationship that they have with their microbes and with each other, because they're all symbiotic. The termites have a complex relationship with each other, and then the microbes also have a relationship with the termite and with each other. It creates this kind of layers of complexity. And when I was first talking with the scientists, one of them said, well, you think the termite's in charge of the microbes, but actually, maybe the microbes are in charge of the termite. And this is really interesting, because then we were drinking coffee, and he said, I mean, how do we know that we're drinking coffee because we want it, and not because of the microbes that are in our guts have told us drink coffee or eat salt or something like that? And as I continued to pursue this question with other microbiologists, they said things like, well, free will is just a rounding error. Anyway, so within about 6 months of this, I was making termite puppets. I still didn't think that I was captured by termites, but I was making termite puppets and amusing my friends with them. And I just kind of kept going. So this is, the other thing that kind of sucked me in was the scientists themselves. This is the Joint Genome Institute, a couple of different people in it. There's Phil Hugenholtz, who was a principal investigator. There's Anna Engelbrechtsen, who was a tech in the lab. I mean, you have to have a master's to have a tech in that lab, but to be a tech there. And Xiaomei He, who was a postdoc student. And these teams work together in a very symbiotic way. I mean, Phil was, in some sciences, there's a strong hierarchy, but here there wasn't. Anna could yell at Phil, she could boss him around. They would have wild fights in the car, and I would have to tell them to stop. And they also, when they work together, sometimes, when you take genetic information, it's actually just a database. And so they would sit in dark rooms, like 9 people in a dark room with 3 or 4 databases, running the databases back and forth, and sometimes talking almost like they were one person, but they were 4 people running the databases, and 2 people would be talking and narrating. And it was like I had been invited into this secret sort of world that you couldn't see unless you had a postgraduate degree. You really had to be deep into this world to see it, and they just very genuinely and sweetly let me in, and it was lovely. But I also got to see how oddly symbiotic they were. The way that we got the termites up, I just need you to know this. We got them up by sucking them up with aspirators. And these aspirators are they're homemade. They're made with some tubing and a test tube and a little tiny auto filter. And air filter, and you go, and the termite comes up and turns at the air filter and heads down into the test tube so that you can get them, and you don't have a mouthful of cow patty or something like that. That's how we would suck them up. And then they would bring them off for analysis. We'd freeze them later that night. This is what's inside termite guts. So up until the 2000s or so, this was the only way to see what was in a termite gut. You could look at it with a microscope. So the little tiny things that are rods are bacteria, and most of the stuff in the termite's gut is bacteria. The big thing is a protist called trichonympha. And trichonympha looks like a very big bacteria, but actually a protist is not a bacteria, and it's not an animal, and it's not a vegetable. It is actually a very complicated symbiotic animal that it has hairs on it that you can see. They're not actually hairs. They help it move, but they're actually spirochetes. So they move because they have symbiotic spirochetes attached to them. It's as if I had squid legs. It is that weird. But they actually have 4 or 5 genomes in one. They're all living together. And symbiosis is so weird. It's extremely strange. They lose their own characteristics. They swap things. They swap genes amongst each other. It's truly fabulous. It also brings up the question of who's in charge, which just comes up again and again and again. So let me just get this straight before we go on to the next thing. Termites are a society, and then inside them, they have a society of microbes. And then inside those microbes, some of them are a society of 5 things cooperating as one. And we haven't even gotten to how the termites themselves cooperate. The other thing that I learned hanging out with the scientists is just how amazing their sort of data display is. This is a phylogenetic tree. It takes a while to learn how to read them, but once you read them, you realize that they're like Shakespearean stories. They're very elaborate. They have all kinds of amazing information in them. This one shows that not all termites are the same. So one kind of termite grabbed its microorganisms way back long time ago, maybe in the dinosaur time, and they've all been evolving together. And the other type of termite on the sort of vertical axis actually just had some that have been evolving forever, and then has some that they have been just running around and grabbing. Like maybe they ate something in elephant poo and they got that in there. So they've got a mix of current things that live outside and their own sort of bespoke proprietary microbes. So by this time I was pretty hooked, and also a weird thing happened. I was living in Berkeley, California, and it turned out that termites were eating my house. Not my house, I was just renting, but they were eating the wall behind my bed, and I wasn't actually that upset. In fact, I was kind of delighted, and I was like, "Ooh, I want to see them! I want to see them!" When they pulled the wall up, and so that was when I realized I'd kind of changed sides. I continued doing more traveling further. I went to Namibia, where these huge Macrotermes mounds are, and this is a researcher named Jeffrey Scott Turner, who's a fabulous writer. This gets into the question of how we know what we know. He began studying these termite mounds about 30 years ago. The lore was that these mounds worked like chimneys, that they exhausted hot air out the top like a chimney. And so he wasn't going to study termite mounds. It was just a random thing he was doing because he was doing some work in southern Africa, and he put some propane in a mound, and he realized it didn't rise like a chimney. It didn't act anything like a chimney. It sloshed around. Sometimes it was a little chimney, like it was one thing and another thing. And so he basically got hooked, and there he was for 3 more decades. And what he realized was that in some ways the mound works like a lung. It brings gases in, it sticks up like a vein into the winds, and it captures those winds and uses them to sort of pump or puff the used gases inside the mound out. But the question then becomes, how do the termites know how to build this crazy thing? One of the things he did was he would pour plaster of Paris inside these mounds. And so you end up with kind of the inverse of the mound. You end up seeing all of these tunnels that the termites build within the mound and how they stack up the dirt. They're really ghostly, weird-looking things, kind of fabulous. They also show that the mound functions a little bit like a brain. Scott believes that they work a little bit like a cognitive system, that the termites are all in there. They know exactly how their world should be. And if an aardvark comes crashing through the side and opens up a hole, they immediately have sort of systems of understanding that that's happened. They understand when fresh air is coming in that there's a problem. And then some of the termites run deep into the mound and set off alarms. They make this rattling noise, or the clicking noise, that sends all the other termites running towards that hole in the mound. They smell the fresh air and they run towards it, and they have balls of dirt in their mouths, and they drop them at the border. And also the soldiers run out there and just blindly launch themselves off the hole. It's pretty amazing. So what are we looking at? Well, inside, the termites have this weird aesthetic. They don't see, so they're feeling along with their little antennae, and when they feel something sticking out, they bite it off. And so they end up with something that looks tremendously like the I think it's the Pan Am terminal at JFK, the one that's in Catch Me If You Can. I mean, they end up with these smooth, weird, organic shapes. How do they do this? How do they build? Well, one of the theories is that they use something called stigmergy, which is that one termite has a ball of mud in its mouth, and it pops that mud down, and the mud has some kind of smell on it, like saliva or something. So then the next termite smells that smell and pops its ball on top of that. And you can see these balls kind of stacking up in the picture. And then that smell gets stronger the more and more termites are stacking up the balls, that smell. And it attracts more and more termites. So it becomes sort of like Twitter, basically, but for mud balls. And then they have some sense of the way this should all work. But this all kind of remains a big mystery. So one of the things, I'll get back to the mystery in just a second. This is what the queen looks like. And the queen the queen originally was about this tall, and then she swells up to the size of a finger after she crawls below ground with the king. They're kind of amazing. They exude pheromones. They control the growth and the behavior of the other termites around them. She is enormous, and she will produce an egg every 3 seconds, sometimes for 20 years. We don't know, maybe for 50 years. It seems interminable. And the other little termites will come in, the worker termites come in, and they clean the eggs away from her, and they lick her, and they feed her food. And when you look at her, has fats under her skin that are swirling. It's really like kind of people freak out when they look at it, basically. But I think it kind of also raises a question of, who's in charge. We think the queen's in charge because we've given it her name, the queen, which is based on colonial concepts. But what's right underneath the queen is the fungus. And these macrotermes have this fungus that they build that digests wood and grass for them. They actually go out, they gather grass, they make it into little balls, and they stack that up in this elaborate comb like you see in the fungus there. And it even they have tiny feet on the bottom of the fungus. And what they do is that fungus dissolves the grasses, and they go running towards it. It dissolves the grasses, so they run around on it, and they find the fungus where it's sort of fruiting there, and where the dissolved sugars are, and they suck them off, and then the termites actually switch those around between each other. So this was, Scott fed some dye to the termites to watch how they switch things. But termites are constantly sort of having a party. They're constantly switching fluids between each other. They're rubbing each other with their antennae, and they're rubbing each other with their antennae. They're begging for drops of poo. They're totally nuts. But what are they actually doing? So Scott actually talked to a group from Harvard, from the Wyss Institute. This is Radhika Nagpal's group. And they are building these amazing robots that are modeled somewhat on termites. This is just a little bit of them building. The robots are coordinating between... They don't coordinate, they're not coordinated by a higher coordinator. They only coordinate themselves by signals on the ground and from each other. So I'm going to see if I can make that play again. Oh, no. Let's see. No. Yeah, there we go. Anyway, they look like toddlers playing but not quite paying attention to each other, and they're quite extraordinary as robots. So what happened was the roboticists wanted to actually track what the termites did, but the roboticists kind of had an idea that termites were like robots. And actually, everybody has an idea that termites are like robots. This is an idea that kind of goes back to Descartes, the idea that animals are robots, soulless automata. And so they started taking video of the termites. And the idea of if a termite is like a robot, then every termite is doing the same job, and they're all kind of involved in the same project, and they're all really working towards the safety of the whole, the security of the whole group. And many people had actually posited that this was the case. But what happened when they actually built a tracker for the termites, this is quite a sophisticated tracker, but they actually were able to track each individual termite for the first time. And they discovered they're not doing the same thing at all. They are actually, most of them are screwing around. They're just running around. So in one dish, 5 are doing the work and 20 are just running around. In another dish, 19 were running around, 2 were doing the work, leading others, and 4 were helping the others. 4 were helping the 2 who were leading. So they were individuals. They're not all on task. Some of them are charismatic. This is some crazy stuff. This is how do we know what we know? This is, termites are a really good example of how little we understand about what we think we understand. And the other thing that they'd realized is that maybe termites are not building because they're stacking balls. Maybe they build because they dig holes. So it's almost like they turned that whole theory of stigmergy upside down, although that's still being fought out in the papers and still being discovered. Ultimately, there's just a tremendous amount to find out about termites. I think something to think about this, what we don't know about termites and what they keep revealing about themselves to us and what they keep revealing to different groups of scientists is that there's just a tremendous amount about the world that we don't know, and we're entering a time of building technology that's based on things like termites. So we're looking to build sort of symbiotic consortiums of organisms to make synthetic biofuels and to make hamburger, to make everything. We're trying to figure out how to capture these symbiotic consortiums' knowledge and use it to our own, put it to our own use. And we're also trying to build things like self-coordinating drones and robots. And we don't really understand how these deeply, deeply complex systems work. I mean, we have sort of metaphors about robots, that the termites are robots, and then it turns out the termites are individuals. As we go into this sort of new technology, we almost need to go back and build ourselves a new Descartes to help us find the language for communicating how these things work. I want to show you the last thing, because termites kind of, I think I ended up writing the book partly because termites rescued me a little bit. I was quite depressed in 2008, and I came to learn things from the termites that made me feel better about the world, I guess. So one of the things is that termite mounds are sort of a center of fertility in the landscape. So when you fly over an area that has a lot of termite mounds, you see this sort of pebbled texture. This is actually kind of some heat or some LiDAR photography that shows those mounds very clearly. But what you'll see is that the mounds in southern Africa or the mounds in Australia have a lot of vegetation on top of them. The termites reorganize the soil, and they mix it up with their feces and nitrogen and all sorts of other stuff to make it very fertile there. So you have these puffs of vegetation growing off the top of the mound, and that's been known for some time. There have been some studies done in southern Africa and in western Africa, in Kenya also, showing that where you have termite mounds, you have more spiders, you have more geckos, you have more birds, you have more elephants, that's in Kenya, and you have more giraffes, because the giraffes are eating the tasty leaves at the top. And the question is, was that part of some bigger system, or was that just sort of a fluke of, termite mounds make things nice, and that's it? An ecologist named Rob Pringle and a mathematician named Corina Tarnita joined forces, and Rob had been studying termite mounds for a long time, and Corina had been studying mathematical patterns in nature for a long time. And there's a question of, when you look at the patterns on the ground, were you looking at something more sophisticated than the polka dots of the mounds? Were you looking at something else? So one day, Rob and Corina went out to a termite mound field, and Corina stood in the back of a truck, and she said, "I think I see another pattern." So what you're looking at here on this slide at the top is mathematical models, and the first slide is of the polka dot pattern of the mounds and the vegetation, and the second slide across the top is a close-up of one of those mounds and the kind of intense vegetation. And then the third picture is how they modeled that there might be kind of spotty, weird, patterned vegetation, not at the mounds, but in the middle. If you look down at the next row of pictures, those are those same things in real life. And what she was able to see, standing in the back of this pickup truck, having kind of an intuitive blast, that she was seeing two types of patterns. One is the polka dot, one is these weird spotty patterns. And they were actually able to then model that on computers, as one does now. And then they were able to match it up with photographs. And they found a couple of sort of astonishing things. One thing is that termites seem to be affecting huge amounts of land around the world, especially the driest parts, and separately they're also in the wet rainforest parts as well. But in these very, very dry places, they are exerting patterns over huge areas. There's a place in Brazil where the termites have patterned the landscape, a landscape the size of England. And then you have that all across Africa, you have it all across Australia, you have it in many places in Asia. We probably have it in the US. And the other thing that they realized is that these landscapes are much, much more resilient to drought. So it's much easier, if this landscape with this kind of patterning and the termite mounds gets a drought, instead of collapsing into kind of infertility, there's many, many, many steps with the termite mounds. They seem to keep the land kind of fertile in really tough times. And I found that actually to be kind of inspiring, I guess. I mean, that was like a bit of good news, is that the termites are toiling. But it also kind of sent me back to that very first time that I was searching for termites on the Termite Safari, because what had I been looking at? I mean, when you look at this landscape, you kind of see a pattern there, and it's the spotty pattern. And, you know, it's possible that the termites are kind of running the world right beneath our feet, and we don't even see it. And for me, I think that was one of the big inspirations for writing this book, was to understand how that worked and to kind of put it into perspective. So I think we have time for questions, about 10 or 12 minutes. Yes?
First off, let me just say one of the great things about the book festival is coming into the presentation you didn't know about in advance, and so this was great. So
I've converted you to termites?
It could be. So you described the termite mounds and like, is that same sort of structure going on in the termites that were eating your wall in your bedroom? I mean, is there a queen in the different layers, or is it a completely different social structure?
Well, they tend to all have queens. Some of them have really weird, some of them have only queens and no kings, because they reproduce parthenogenically. And some, there's apparently one where there's 2 kings and no queen. I don't know how that works. That's a paper I haven't read. But the termites in my walls did not have a fungus. They just had the microbes in their guts. There's many different ways of being a termite. There's about 3,000 different kinds, and some have the protists, the big hairy things, and some have just a simple complement of bacteria, and then some of them have that whole fungus business. So it's all different, and some make the mounds. Sometimes when you take the mound-building termites from one place to another, they learn to build a different kind of mound, and that's very weird. They can build little mounds that look like an ice cream scoop, and they build tall mounds that look like cathedrals, and it's really weird. They're something else.
Hello. I'm thinking you're giving us hope that when we destroy the earth, termites will be there to start vegetation going again.
If you call that hope, I'm with you. Yes?
So I guess it may be a little bit a strange question, but I just thought when you said, I guess I didn't know about this process, that animal that can digest like stuff like, because it's basically digesting cellulose, I guess. They can eat trees. Did anybody think about maybe the future of humanity when we run out of everything else? Maybe we can get those microbes to have in our digestive system, and then we can there'll be probably...
We can eat wood.
Yeah, is it something that anybody considers? Or maybe even eat some more terrible things, because there are apparently microbes that can digest anything, so as long as we can adapt them.
Yes. Okay, so this is a complicated question. So do humans want to digest wood themselves? Well, actually, I leave that to you to decide whether you want to digest the wood. Yes, in terms of survival, it's, wood doesn't have a whole lot in it. So the termites also have to fix the nitrogen, and they have a lot of sort of microbial tricks in their stomach. But there are people who have fed termites terrible things like bituminous coal, and then over many generations, the termites' microbes learn how to break that down. So actually, termite microbes have been used in environmental remediation projects that are fairly sophisticated. So there's evolution is enormous, and there are many things that we can do. I am not ready to eat wood yet, personally. So
what is the effect of the pesticides that we use to prevent termites from coming into our house? What do they do to termite colonies?
We don't, well, there are about 3,000 kinds of named termites in the world, and there are probably another 2,000 or 3,000 that we don't have names for. And of those, all of those, 27 of them are the pest termites. So there has been a tremendous amount of effort put into killing those pest termites. What's interesting is that the pest termites really spread because of humans. They spread during wartime when munitions in wooden boxes are being shipped around the world, or railroad ties. They really have been a human spread thing, and they also are encouraged by human sort of environmental upheaval. Generally, it's extremely hard to kill a termite. They don't get sick because they spend a lot of time grooming each other, and if somebody's sick, they seem to kind of wall them off. Some academics think that termites vaccinate each other, which is, kind of mind-blowing. Generally, they try to do something that will generally the poisons no longer involve heavy-duty spraying. And we don't use the really strong kinds of pesticides in the US anymore. Generally, it's baits that they then carry that material back to the nest, and it hopefully shuts off the queen's fertility or does something along those lines. However, one thing that we do know is that there are lots of beneficial kinds of termites, and that those termites do seem to be affected by human development, by upheaval, by possibly by some of the other sorts of pesticides that we spray. And so in some places where they've actually studied what termites are there, they found that the beneficial termites seem to be lesser as people live or farm more intensively. Yes?
Yeah, 2 questions. Are there certain types of wood that termites don't find palatable? And the soil types, are there special soil types that termites tend not to want to live in?
Are you looking to build a utopian community?
Well, I've heard that it's mentioned that purple heart and maybe green heart are sort of resistant to termites.
Right.
So
yeah, I think there are different ways of treating the wood with pressure and other things to make it unpalatable to termites. They don't eat some aromatic woods like cedar. And the soil types, termites are really good with soil. I don't know, I can't tell you. You should talk to an exterminator, I think. They're more likely to know. But the other thing about termites is that over the past 20 years or so, half of the papers written about termites have been about how to kill them. So, are there any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, very interesting talk. I'm wondering why you want them to have individual behavior versus being automaton. I mean, is it bad if they just have a simple set of scripts and some of them, like in that petri dish or whatever it was, simply were in a different part of that subroutine? The folks that make robots can make a very simple set of instructions, and they have very individual or seemingly different behavior just because of their environment and what they bump into. Humans can be arguably about the same. But is there some reason beyond that why you want to promote the individualism of termites, and it somehow gets the science further along?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm not sure I have time to unpack it all here, but I think the words about individuality actually came from the roboticists themselves, because they actually knew that their robots were individuals, because every robot has a different set of cheap sensors, and each robot has sort of a different knowledge and a different way of reacting to the environment. And so what shocked the roboticist, Kirsten Peterson, who actually did the work, was she said, I should have known. I spend all my time building these robots where each, the red one has a different personality than the blue one, and I should have known that they were individuals. So there's that. The other issue that came up is that they have memories, so they were not stochastic. They were not just always reacting at the moment. They actually had memories, and we don't know if some termites have bigger memories than other termites. And this business of some seeming to model or lead the others was also kind of extraordinary. So that was basically their language. Now, you raised the interesting question of whether humans are actually some sort of robot. I think is what you were saying, like we might all just be running sort of slightly different scripts and reacting. Well, this is a big question, and I guess it actually just, this idea that termites are kind of a guide, a very tiny guide to like huge ideas is, that is proved. So, are there any more questions? Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much.